Oh, just give us a second here.
That's as high as I can turn it.
That should be loud enough. All right, well, this is Marty Wilson. I'm in the office of Peter Hawks, Dean of Arts and Sciences at East Stroudsburg University, and we have on the phone with us today Ron King. Now, today is November 17th. It's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of 2017, and we're here to talk about Sterling Strauser. Now, Peter, did you want me to go over this?
I'll just do the background.
Okay, go ahead.
So, Ron, just a little background first. Gray Carter was a longtime friend of Sterling Strauser, and he donated a large collection of Strauser paintings to ESU. So, as you know, ESU is located 3 or 4 blocks from where Strauser lived at 150 Analumic Street, and the university has promised to build a gallery dedicated to Strauser and his circle. So right now the collection is housed in a beautiful new building on campus. We have fundraising events and tours by appointment. And Gray Carter also wanted an oral history project. So we've been interviewing people who knew him. So this interview today is part of that effort.
Okay.
Okay, so go ahead.
Now I forget, because we talked to him. Did we ask for permission?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh,
Did we get the release, since I turned the recorder on, Ron? Let's just do that again to be safe. Do you agree to gift this interview to the university, Ron?
Yes, I do. I'll be happy to sign something if you need it, but I'm glad to.
All right, great. Well, let's start with how you first met Sterling Strauser.
Okay. Well, my father had an art gallery in Nashville called Liaison Incorporated. We did picture framing, and we sold artworks. It was incorporated in 1948 after World War II. My dad was a bomber pilot in the war and had a long relationship with Sterling. I was born in the early 60s, and as far as I can remember, we would travel from Nashville up to East Stroudsburg in the spring and the fall and purchase paintings from Sterling and from Dot. We got the hookings and watercolors as well, and then the oils from him. And so that really goes back to the early 60s. Of course, you know, when my memory can begin, maybe 6 or 7 would be, I have a painting that Sterling did of me. Sterling had a grandson, Kenny, and he and I were raking leaves one day when Dad was up there, and I'll have to send you all a picture of it. I'm standing there with a bucket of leaves in my little blue jeans, and I think he did one of Kenny and did one of me at the same time. So that's about as far back as I can remember.
Well, how did your dad? I'm sorry. How did your dad first hear about Sterling?
Okay, that is a real interesting question to me, because it goes back to the war. Dad had their summer home was in Long Island, New York, not just a few hours from where Sterling lived, and his backdoor neighbor, they had 21 acres on Montauk Highway, and if you look directly behind that property, there was a little walkway that went to an artist named David Berlew and David and Marusha. We called him Mama and Papa Berlew. Into the United States, I guess in the 20s, had that property. A POW in Russia during World War II, which is very, very rare, a POW in an Allied country. But there's a meeting at the University of Tennessee Press.
Ron,
that'll go into that.
Ron, you're breaking up.
He came home. Oh no!
Yeah.
Oh, I hate that.
Do you have a? Are you on a cell phone?
I tell you what. Would it be hard for you to call on another number if this cell phone's breaking up?
Sure. What's the number?
Let me give you a second number.
Okay.
It's 615 6418.
And the area code?
Area code 615-370-6418.
Okay. All right.
All right, we'll call you right back.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we'll try that one. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Hi, is that better?
Yeah, that's much better.
That's much better. So could we start that story again about how your dad heard about Sterling?
Sure, absolutely. Dad was a POW in Russia. He was shot down over Berlin in 1945 and got his plane behind the Russian line. And there's a story published by the University of Tennessee Press, a wonderful book called The Wars of Myron King that really explained what went on there. But when he came home from that, he was able to get out and came home. He and David Berluke became very close friends. As I said before, their properties adjoined on Long Island. And Berluke's wife, we call her Mama, Marusha Berluke, had escaped from Russia during the revolution. She was of Russian nobility, and they escaped across Vladivostok. They had a Japanese gunboat picked them up and took them to Japan. And so when Dad got home, he was full of all these stories about Russia and how it was going to be a culture war between us and them. And David Berluke was about the only person that would listen to him because everyone else was so glad the war was over. They didn't want to hear about a conflict with Russia. But Berluke, of course, Dad loved the artist side of him, and the art talent, but also just the political side. Well, David and Strauser were friends, and they painted. I'm not sure how they met exactly, but Strauser, my understanding was he had a show in a gallery in New York that went bankrupt and did not return his paintings and did not pay him for him. And David Berluke said he knew Dad had started the gallery down in Nashville in '48, and he said, "You just need to let Myron sell your works for you. He'll treat you fairly, and is not going to take advantage like that." So that was our introduction to Sterling. Was through David Berluke, and really that his heroic acts in the war caused both of those men to respect him and want to work with him. So Dad had shows for Berluke. He arranged a show at Cheekwood Museum. Was the first show there was David, and then Sterling came down to Lizon's. I remember I was very young, probably in the 70s. Sterling came down and did a talk show we had in town. Now back then was called the Noon Show with Teddy Bart, and Sterling had this little kit, Paint the Strauser Method, and he had a little, like a plastic bag that had the masonite and the some sandpaper and the oil paints, and so he painted a beautiful painting in the 30 minutes that he was being interviewed there. And I remember one thing that Sterling said. He told me later. He said, that Teddy Bart, he really he shook me up because he was being so nice. But then when they turned the camera on, he said, "Sterling, why do you paint?" And Sterling said, "I paint to celebrate the gift of sight." He had his cataract surgery, and he thought, "Wow, that was the right thing to say." So anyway, he did this painting, and we ended up selling that painting for $450 to a high-class lady here in town who was excited to get it. Well, Dad got a copy of that video and sent it to her sometime later. Well, when she saw him paint that painting, she brought the painting back and said she wasn't going to give $450 for any old painting that was done in 30 minutes. She thought he had done it way too fast, so she returned it, and I still actually have that painting.
Now,
that's kind of the early history I think of with
that painting. You said was done by a kid.
It was done. He actually had a little kit. He encouraged folks in Nashville to use his style and form of painting. He wanted to start a movement, and he did it as an example. I guess it was part of that kit, but it was a medium size, probably 20 by 24. And as they were interviewing him, they were filming him painting it.
I don't remember hearing about a kit before. Have you?
No.
Is that something, do you think maybe he was just doing in Nashville? Or
I think it was just sort of an experimental thing. I don't know that he ever really marketed it. He really. That was about the only time I recall, and I know that somewhere in our boxes there would be a one of those big fat reel-to-reel films of that interview somewhere.
So what was in the kit?
It was just it had some paints, and it had a piece of masonite, and he had some sandpaper and some painting knives and that sort of thing, some charcoal. Basically, just the basics of what it would have taken him to paint.
But was the intention of this kit to get other people painting, or was it just for himself? Or
oh no, it was to get others. There's probably 25 artists around Nashville who were strongly influenced by him, and specifically, I know Harold Krauss and Anna Japp I'd have to Paige Moorhead. There were a number of them who worked on doing that style. They weren't directly copying, but there was one, Dick Thomas, that he came the closest to painting like Sterling of anyone I've ever seen. But Sterling just wanted folks to have fun painting the way he did. Now after that trip, I don't ever remember hearing about the kit anymore, and we never sold it. I think it was just something he was just playing around with, honestly.
So who is if we were going to interview somebody, you said there are 25 people influenced, who would you recommend?
They were in. I would need to get back with you on that. I'll need to make a list on that because I don't know that these people ever met Sterling.
Okay.
They just liked his style of painting. Really, was what I'm getting at there.
So Ron, your dad was, he opens up a gallery, but you're the son. When did you get interested in, what was it about Sterling's work that intrigued you?
I studied engineering in school, so I'm not an art expert. Dad went to 5 art colleges during his career and read. He had quite a library. I always liked the three-dimensional aspect, the colors. We would go, like I said, as a child, we would go, and he would always have a little painting for us or do one. So my room has always had a Strauser and a Savitsky train and that artwork. As I look right now in my den, I see a couple Strausers as well as other pieces by other artists. But I've always been intrigued with it because it almost it's just so loose and fun. It's like how does it work? But you look at them year after year, and they're just timeless. So that's kind of the perspective I have on them.
All right, so you said you were in East Stroudsburg a number of times, and you got to see him paint a number of times, I assume.
Right.
So do you have any memories about, did he have an unusual style, or was there anything unusual about the way he painted?
I thought it was very unusual. We've had one of the top art dealers that we've ever worked with was Heinz Otto, who ran, at the time, 17 galleries across Europe. And he was very amazed with Strauser's use of color. And what amazed me, in the gallery, we had artists that would work with restorations and different things, and they would have these color charts and their paints spread out so neatly and organized. Sterling, on the other hand, would maybe cross his legs and sit down on the floor, and he had a box of oil tubes that were, some of them half open, and he would just start squirting that out on the board and working with it on his knives, and it was just so haphazard. It was just marvelous how he could work like that. He knew what was in those tubes, and the way it would marbleize on the masonite was just incredible, operating in such a manner, such an informal way.
So you said your dad was really the more academic artist or trained artist, but how would you characterize Sterling as a painter? He's been called a modernist, for example. How would you characterize his painting?
The term that I find the most accurate is a momentalist. He would capture a moment. There's one painting that I would, in particular, I would love to see in the museum someday, and it's a gray, sort of geometric type work called Rifle in the Window on the back, and it was done the day that J.F. Kennedy was shot. Very dark and gray. It has both action and sadness. He was moved by what went on that particular day, and he picked up his palette and his knife and painted that. There's another one in the museum, the Carter Museum, that we gifted to them, a very large painting of on President Carter's inaugural walk. He painted Mr. and Mrs. Carter going down Pennsylvania Avenue with the little peanut sign off to the side. Very, very wonderful painting. But that was what was going on that day, and that's what he that's what he did. If he saw the train station in the snow, that's what was on his mind, and he would capture that moment. If it was the temporary beauty of a flower, he would capture that. That's the term I like to use. I use expressionism and momentalist.
Huh. Good. So that painting you described, is that the Carter Library? Is that
the Jimmy?
It is down in Georgia.
No kidding.
Presidential Library.
Oh. Did you
not
library,
Ray
yeah.
Carter.
No. I understand. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Huh. So you must own several of his works, I take it, Ron.
Yes, I do, and a couple of I saw him so much as an interesting character, as much as an artist. Every time I went, he was full. He never stopped talking philosophy. And he felt that every person was an artist. If they were a good cook, they were an artist in the kitchen. If they were a truck driver, they were an artist, of the wheel, whatever. If we worked with a passion. I do know that David Berluc, some of these stories you may have on CITIC's tape, so if I'm repeating something, let me know. But David Berluc somewhere, I guess it was in the 50s, Sterling was working at the Boiler Works. He was office manager of the Boiler Works, and he was getting cataracts. And David Berluke told him, he said, Sterling, if your works are never going to amount to anything because you haven't painted enough to be famous, and now you're going blind, you're not going to be able to paint anymore. Well, that made Sterling so put out that he took early retirement and had cataract surgery and painted for the rest of his life. So it was that nudging by Berluke. Now, Berluke estimated he had painted 18,000 paintings in his lifetime, and I suspect Strauser's probably in that range too.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't have an idea, but I'm just guessing. So that's sort of what got Sterling into the point where we could go see him like we did. Sterling had an eye. I do know this about him. We would go up there, and he would say, let's go to the flea market. And I'd think, what in the world? Here we are near New York. You know, we've got all this great art in this house. He wanted to go to the flea market. Well, Sterling, we would go to the flea market. He would pick out art and stuff for pennies on the dollar. That stuff ended up being what we started working with Sotheby's online back in the early 2000s as a Sotheby's associate. We're a former Sotheby's associate, but it was those things that Sterling, his eye was so good, he would pick out these things that I didn't. Dad probably understood what was going on, but great art that we ended up being some of our top sellers. So from that standpoint, I really respected his ability to judge other artworks of other artists. Also, I've seen many artists come through our gallery and just be stunned when they saw Sterling's work for the first time. They'd be talking and looking around, and then they would just kind of freeze up when they saw that and start taking it in. That was always very impressive. And then whenever Dad would be introduced to a new artist through one of the dealers or something, he would carry a sample up and show Sterling and say, hey, what do you think of this? And sometimes Sterling would go, oh, wow, that guy's really got it. And then, well, that's interesting or something. And that's how Dad picked out a lot of his artists, was seeing what Sterling thought of it, which is amazing. Sterling being self-taught. I know Dad would say, don't take lessons because you're American. You're a completely American painter. If you take lessons, you're going to be influenced by European techniques and thoughts. So that always fascinated me, and certainly his love of the folk art and outsider art was really unique. I know one story. This is outside the art world, but I think of it because Sterling got such a kick out of telling this story. He was a happy man. He always had a smile, but he had a friend that was in management at the Buck Hill Inn somehow, and we went up there. He said, I want to take y'all to the Buck Hill Inn. So we go up there to eat dinner, and Sterling's got this little leather art vest on, and we've been traveling, and so we get in there, and the host that greets us didn't recognize him, and Sterling got the biggest kick because here he is friends with the manager, but he turns around in a very loud voice in front of all the guests, says, we do not serve transients. And Sterling, he had more fun telling that story. we were turned out of the Buck Hill Inn, and I know it's burned a long time ago. But I think about the wonderful meals we had. Dot she would fix tea and wonderful tapioca when we would go up there, and we would be hot and working hard, and it was just such a delight. The table in the kitchen there,
yeah.
he always wanted to paint a book called "The Artist I Have Met and Ate With," and I love. I've got a painting or two he did around that table, and I think of all the artists that had eaten in his little kitchen there.
So, Ron, I lived across the street from Sterling.
Yeah.
So he was at 150 Antelope. I lived in 159.
Okay.
And from 1986 to 1995 when he died.
Oh yeah.
And I remember seeing your father come. It was like a white panel truck.
Well, we had we had different. We
vehicles.
had a two-tone van at one point, and then before that, probably let's see. If you were there, 86. We used to come up in a. We had a old Jimmy, GMC Jimmy. We would drive up, and then later a van, and we may have rented something at different times too. A white van. That would be right. I know I've got photographs and all some of those trips that are mixed in with our family slides.
So I remember. I remember the vehicle. You put those emergency blinkers on.
Okay.
And you park right in front of his house because there's no parking.
Yeah.
And then
I do remember coming up an alley, around behind his house sometime.
There also was an alley.
I remember, of course, the porches and the ice house in the back,
Right.
and then he had a garage that was kind of up on the other corner where I know at one point he drove a Corvair, a Chevy Corvair, one of those little air-cooled cars.
Yeah.
And
so when you
the
came,
two-story house that Dad, you would go in, it would just have that wonderful smell of the linseed oil and just art everywhere.
Right.
And Dot had an antique toy collection.
Yeah.
And then upstairs there were Berlukes. And I remember back in the early days, Dad would say, "I bet there's $4 million worth of art in this house."
Yeah.
and
so how long did you stay there on your trips? Was it just a day?
It was usually just a couple days. We would spend 2 days driving both ways, and then we'd be there a day or two. It wasn't a long trip, but it was more just a business trip type thing.
Where did you stay? Where did you stay?
There was. I picture it very clearly. It was in East Stroudsburg. It had a diner and a swimming pool. It was a hotel, and I cannot think of the name of it right now, but I can picture it so well. But we usually stayed there in town.
Was it the Budget Hotel?
It might have been. There was a swimming pool. I remember there was an indoor swimming pool, and there was a little diner that had the little bee pollen advertisements. Cute little diner. And I also remember there was like of course there was a train depot and the hardware. We'd walk around that little strip, but I cannot remember. It was either in Stroudsburg or East Stroudsburg.
Was it right near the highway?
Probably was. I almost I wish I could give you that name for sure, but I wasn't the one making the reservations at that point, and I just
so you drive up and then arrive. When did you arrive at the house? In the morning?
We would
afternoon.
We'd usually arrive in an afternoon.
Yeah.
And then we'd have the full next day. We'd stay, I guess, 2 nights normally. So we would have or maybe 2 or 3 nights, and then have the next day or two. Dad and Sterling would meet, and Dad would usually take some artwork. They would trade some things, and then Sterling would they had a little way of packing them so it wouldn't damage them when we traveled, and I'd help them load up.
So did your father give him cash for the paintings?
We had an arrangement. Yes, the shop wrote checks for them, and it was very official. We had it was basically a monthly installment that that we would pay him a regular fee month to month, and then he would supply us with paintings in the spring and fall.
Okay. So he told me his arrangement was that you were the sole distributor of his art, but he could sell from the house.
That's right. That was my understanding as well.
Yeah. And then also there was trading, right? That your father.
Yeah, I know that he liked Red Grooms, Paul Lancaster, Clarence Stringfield, William Edmondson from here in the Nashville area, and sometimes they would trade things. So.
Yeah, I have some Paul Lancaster paintings that I bought from Sterling, and he told me he got in a trade.
Right. Yes, that would be correct.
Yeah.
Well, what can you tell us about Dorothy? You mentioned her once or twice.
Oh my, she was. I see her pretty smile too. Dorothy was so sweet, short, petite lady, little round. I understand Sterling told us once that all the nudes that he ever painted were of Dot. So we sold a number of wonderful nude paintings that he did. She was the businesswoman. She made sure everything stayed on track, and that everything was accounted for, and I remember that about her. She and Mom, they loved each other, and like I say, I recall her hookings. We would always purchase some hookings, and the Dorothy Strauser, the watercolor works, which we have sold constantly throughout the history of Liaisons. We've had them, and still have several. The hookings are about gone, but it amazed me how she would take those fabrics and dye them and put them together in almost a Russian style. Just wonderful, wonderful artist herself.
So, what's the status of the Liaison Gallery?
The property where we had the gallery sold in 2015. We still have a C-Corp, and I'm selling things through a gallery here in town. We have some works by Sterling. It's called the Nina Kuzina, Ninakuzina. She's a lady that has a very nice gallery on the Harding Road area in Nashville, and she loved Sterling. I don't know that she ever met him. But you could look her up online and perhaps give her a call.
Yeah. So in other words, Liaison, the property is sold, but you still have the website.
We have a website, and I do utilize eBay some. I've got a few pieces there, and as well as some of the auction, Brunk auction and Sloten. Auction we've used, as well as Gene Shapiro, and even a few things at Sotheby's. So we're just using other outlets, and no longer have that wonderful. It was a 10,000 square foot gallery and workshop that we had on Thompson Lane. And one thing in particular, when Sterling passed there in '95, we filled all the galleries. There was a downstairs and an upstairs, and we filled every wall with Sterling's paintings for several months in honor of him.
Yeah.
And when we took those down and put back up the mix of things that would have included decorative European Impressionist works and that sort of thing, which I love many of the other artists too, but it amazed me the sparkle and power that was lost with by putting up our regular mix of paintings. You know, that really struck me as how he could do flowers, and the majority of what we sold over the year were the floral works, because that's what the folks wanted in their dining room and in their formal rooms. They fit the in the more recent years. There's been a much greater interest in the portraits and other landscapes and things, it seems like. But during the 70s and 80s, the florals were where it was at with his sales. Right. But even with the florals, how they could be so different and so many different colors and designs to be so interesting. It was amazing.
Yeah, I'm looking at a poinsettia he did in 1992, right here in my office. So, how would you characterize his following in Nashville?
Well, one thing that we used to say and notice was when a person would come in and buy a Strauser, so many of them would make sure they had as many Strausers as they had children, because they didn't want those children fighting over who got the Strausser. And we never had another artist like that, to where that particular thing, they would get them, and some people would walk in and it looked messy to them, that loose, free, fast style that he had, and they'd say, well, my grandkid could paint something like that, and Dad would say, well, you better get it, if they can do like that, you better have them painting, because, he's really got something. And then other people that would try to copy him, you could always tell, how is it, I'm looking at one now, that you can't copy it. He told Dad once, he said, I don't mean to brag, but you really have to be able to draw well to paint like this. When you're doing that charcoal, cutting through the wet paint like that, you've got to get it right the first time. Yeah. And some of the ones that just come to my mind, he loved circus performers and acrobats, and he could do a woman with about 6 strokes. It was just incredible. Or a horse, a trotter, how he could capture the feel of a trotter so simply, how he could simplify it so, and then it was done. He'd pick up his charcoal and knife and move on to something else. That's not easy to do. It's really not.
Yeah.
Ron, I'm not that big of an art fan. I mean, I enjoy it as much as anyone. And every time I've done one of these interviews, I've always asked, what do you see in the art? How does it speak to you? And I think of everybody I've listened to, you've said it the most eloquently. Now I'm looking at his art completely differently.
Well, now another thing I'll say about it, if you were dealing with an artist like Van Gogh or Da Vinci or something like that, you could probably come up with a price per square inch or something that would be, their art is probably quite consistent. Sterling would go so fast that it wasn't necessarily consistent. He called it quality of attention. He told me the story once or told me and Dad, the little boy, there was a neighbor boy that came by one day. Sterling was out on his front porch painting some flowers, some daffodils or something, and the little boy saying, Mr. Strauser, what you doing? He said, well, I'm painting these flowers. And the little boy looked at it and he shook his head and he said, well, you sure missed it. And so that was his opinion. So there was great, there's a great spectrum when you look at them he wasn't afraid to experiment. Sometimes he would paint on the back of a board where it had the little bumps in it. I've got some like that. And sometimes he would dribble paint on them, you know. I do have several really early pieces he did as a teenager in his early 20s that are like lake scenes. It was before he developed his typical style. But it's, to me, very interesting to see, you know, where he came from there in the transformation. It amazes me. You mentioned the one done in the early 90s. I'm amazed how good some of the later ones are as he was getting ill and didn't feel good. How beautiful he was able to carry on late up in life. Now, my dad painted, but when he was young, everything was very precise and pretty. As he got older, he got real shaky, and you know, it's just a totally different look. We love him, but it wasn't like Sterling.
Yeah.
He didn't preserve his touch. I don't know if this was on Siddig's tape or not, but I remember Sterling saying, if I look at something or someone and I'm looking at him and I pick up my brush and paint, it's going from my eye to my hand. But he said, I like to look at someone and then go in another room and then paint them. And he said, then it's going from my mind to my hand. And I've never heard another artist say that. Most artists like to have a photograph and see the person in you know, there. I know my wife, when I got married in '86, about the same time you moved in there, and she was a very pretty lady, and we went up and she painted, Sterling painted her portrait and had her hold her hand up, and he said, I love to paint your hand. That shows, you know, I'm a good artist when I can do your hand. But then he said, you know, it's really hard to paint a beautiful person. You know, it's easier in his style to paint someone maybe that has unique, outstanding characteristics, but just I thought that was an interesting comment.
Well, we've kept you for 40 minutes, although it seems like 5 minutes. I was surprised to look at the clock. I hope, are we tiring you out? Should we bring this to a close?
Well, I tell you, I would love to come up there, and I think I've pretty much covered a lot of my memories. So
I just have one more question.
Be fine unless you have any other questions. I'm certainly here. So
yeah, I have one more question.
Right.
Okay, so you know he was to me he was a fine artist, but he also was a great promoter of other artists.
Yes, absolutely.
So, and I'm thinking of Justin McCarthy, Jack Savitsky, and Victor Gatto. And so did you ever, and I know he traded some of those, did you ever meet any of those three?
I remember Berluc, and I know my mother talked about meeting McCarthy and Savitsky. Yeah. I don't recall ever meeting them.
Yeah.
You know, I did think of two other thoughts that I always found interesting about Sterling. When we would go up there, he always had a black and white TV for years and years, and he would tell Dad, he said, I'm just afraid to get a color TV. I'm afraid it'll mess up my sense of color. And I remember at some point we went up there, and there was a local bank that had offered a deal. If you opened up a checking account, they would give you a free color TV. And we went up there, and he had this color TV, and he had decided it would be okay. It wasn't going to mess up his sense of color. So that's one little story I remember. I've never heard of anyone scared of the TV hurting their eye. But another thing that I picked up on, Sterling loved to see, as he promoted other artists, he loved to see them do well and succeed. And when Berluc's auction prices went up, you know, he was so excited to say, "Oh, this watercolor sold for $9,000." You know, wow. He was so excited about it. He never seemed to want that for himself. He wanted to do well, but it was almost as if he had a humble spirit, and he almost seemed to act like, I don't know if he ever stated it, but he never seemed to care that his own works, he loved to be complimented, yeah. But it wasn't his goal to make a fortune on a painting, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
He loved the artwork. I remember I mentioned earlier Heinz Otto, the art dealer from Europe, who has the Otto Gallery. I don't know his status now. I'm sure he's retired. I hope he's still living. But he loves art for the artwork itself. And he always said his son was a businessman, you know, and everything was about business. But to him, it was about the art. And Strauser was really that way. It was funny how he wanted to see his friends do well, but when it came to him, he was a little scared of that color TV, and he was scared of being too famous, I think.
So one of the questions we have here, Ron, is, gets to his legacy or what students can learn from him, and I think you've kind of addressed that. Do you have anything else to say along those lines?
What students could learn from him. He told me he wanted to, a system of painting that he could complete a painting in 30 minutes. So that he wanted to have a painting painting style that was fun, and he didn't mind getting messy. As far as teaching, I remember him saying that when he would watch his granddaughter paint and roll the brush and all that, but he would say stop. You know, as she would be drawing something, he said it's so important to know when to stop and leave it alone. You know, it's so easy to overwork a painting. Yeah. So I guess that would be as I look at these and see the marbleized color, the comment that Dad used to say, the colors that he used are in oil paint, so many of them are semi-precious gemstones, and he would tell a client, unless your jeweler that made the jewelry you're wearing was as good of artist as Sterling, it's just he would have him look at the details in those paintings up close and say, now, is your jewelry as pretty as this? Because this is gemstones in these colors. And I don't know if I'm saying it just right, but that's pretty good. He also had a story of he went up to New York and watched the special on Rembrandt, and they started out with a slide of an old lady, and they would show another slide that went in a little closer, and then one that went on her hand, and then one that went on the highlight of her thumbnail. And he said when Rembrandt painted this painting, he had to make this woman look like the woman, but when it came down to the highlight on the thumbnail, he was free to create a beautiful abstract painting that was prettier than 95% of the abstracts on Madison Avenue at the time. So that was one of the stories. I think of that highlight on the thumbnail, and that's sort of like Strauser's flowers that have those beautiful combinations of color and shape.
Well, Ron, one final question: is there something else that we should have asked you? Is there something that we might have skipped over that you think is relevant?
I think you've done a very fine job. Like I say, I love his art, and I've sold it for years. I saw him as a friend. If you want to, my sister used to say when someone asked her about him once, she said, "Well, he's a cross between my favorite grandfather and Santa Claus, and that's really the personality he had. He was always so happy and so upbeat that I remember he would use the term ballyhoo, and he was just the finest fella, and then that's why Dot sort of had to be the office manager that kept everything businesslike and all. He could get so carried away, but it was wonderful times and wonderful folks.
So Ron, you mentioned you might like to come up here.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Well, that'd be
my
great.
wife and I we've talked about it, and are so excited to hear y'all's continuing work with this.
Yeah.
I know Gray was my understanding. I had an uncle, Raymond King. We called him Hootie. That was a metal worker, and ended up he ended up living where Dad grew up in that area on Montauk Highway there, and he and Gray were friends. He used to call him Captain Carter, and then Colonel Carter with his Air Force history, and certainly Carter has done a wonderful job in helping the world learn about Lancaster and Strauser, and I know we were always so busy doing the framing and all that we weren't really reaching out to the museums and collectors like he were. We were just selling to the local Nashvillians and providing reasonable art and that kind of thing. So it was wonderful when he came along and helped with his promoting skills there.
Well, you're certainly welcome to come up here, and if you let us know ahead of time, we'll arrange a tour of the Innovation Center where the paintings are, and you can meet different people, and we'll have a good time.
Okay, I'll look forward to it.
Okay.
All right, well, thanks very much, Ron. I enjoyed this talk very much.
Well, thank you so much, Marty and Peter, and I look forward to speaking again and getting to see y'all.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Thanks very much, Ron.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.